Hello, air miners. We are at a turning point on climate action. Since the last time we were here together, the White House has deleted climate change from its websites. Funding has been frozen up, and a lot of DOE roles working on carbon removal have been zapped. We have this moment to pull things together onto a different path before the tide turns, and more organizations globally remove climate change from their websites and withdraw from climate commitments. At the same time, there are thousands of sustainability leaders around the world who want to take action on the climate now. I have had the opportunity to speak with dozens of these leaders over the last 4 weeks. What I found are people who can't wait to take action, people who want to get behind a good strategy. There hasn't been one. Some of them have budgets, some of them don't. Some of you have the dream of, hey, you know what? I'd just like to do this year. If you want to take action on carbon removal, today is for you. Your next step in carbon removal might be asking a question. It might be talking with your colleague about this. It can be reaching out to one of the startup companies that's removing carbon for a call about diligencing their credits. It can be reading some documentation PDF or drafting a contract with a marketplace or with consultants, or maybe even pitching your CEO on a budget. Our intent with the next hour isn't to inform you or give you knowledge. It's to have you taking action and making the difference for the climate that you dream of making, and that those actions build to a stable climate. This is your window to make the difference for the climate. So maybe you're thinking, look, I work at a big company, but I'm not in the sustainability department. I am super glad you're here. You can be the person to go contact your sustainability department and say, hey, I went to this event. I want us to make carbon removal purchases this year. That can be you. Maybe you're an investor. You've got LPs, you've got investors into your fund. Imagine after today, you take what you've found today, you level up your thesis, and you reach out to them with a new angle for a big new fund. We've had startup founders invite their investors to this event. We've had them include potential investors, people who are on the fence, who would really benefit from this bigger picture. I'm glad you're all here. Some of you invited your customers. Hey, customers, folks include their supply chain partners. Hey, supply chain partners, you get to hear today about what happens with those parts and raw materials that you're providing, and figure out how to add carbon removal to your business. And if you're watching this video online in the future, hello to thousands of sustainability leaders. At Air Miners, we want every major corporation taking action on carbon removal. That's key for the strategy for reversing climate change. So in this section with Grant Faber, he is going to be showing you what your next steps could be. We're going to cover a lot of ground together. I encourage you to listen and find what your next step is going to be, and ask questions along the way. We've got the chat over here, and we'll have a live Q&A at the end. A bit about Grant. He has been a leader in carbon removal for a long time, most recently at the US Department of Energy. He's the former program manager of the Direct Air Capture Hubs program. He's also formally started his own consulting business, analyzing carbon removal credits and carbon removal startup companies. If you're a startup founder, you probably know Grant well. He's worked with most of the 200 graduates of our Launchpad Accelerator program. And he is the best person on the planet to have this conversation today and to help you discover what your next step in participating in carbon removal is. I encourage you to listen. I encourage you to ask questions. I encourage you to come up and ask a question live at the end. We're here today to have you take your next action, and it's those actions that sum up to you reversing climate change. And with that, I am pleased to introduce you to Grant Faber.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much, Tito, for the nice intro. And yeah, thank you, everyone, for taking the time today. Yeah, we're very grateful that in these crazy times we're all facing, that you took the time to join us today. And yeah, we thank you for your interest in carbon removal as well. So as Tito said, I'm going to walk through some slides, but we're going to hopefully have ample time for Q&A at the end. So please, save up your questions, put them in the Q&A or the chat box or anything. And yeah, afterward, please feel free to ask them live too, and we can discuss them. It's totally okay to have questions about anything. No question is too basic or anything like that, because we are all on this journey together. So I'm going to share here and jump into it. So, okay. Today we're going to be chatting about due diligence for carbon dioxide removal purchasing. So I'm going to start actually by giving a quick intro to myself. So yes, as Tito mentioned, I most recently worked at the Department of Energy as a DACOPS program manager and Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. I see a few of my former colleagues and friends on the call today, so thank you very much for joining. It's great to see you. Working at DOE, fabulous experience. The team there is top-notch, world-class, really cares about advancing this industry holistically and in the right way. So yeah, very grateful for my time that I was able to spend there. And yeah, I've bounced around the carbon tech world in different roles. Was fortunate to work with a lot of different companies in my consultancy, largely focused on life cycle and techno-economic assessment, but also did a bunch of other stuff, due diligence, market research, and just general strategic advising. So yeah, I also write for my Substack Carbon-Based Commentary, where I just write on random cool things in carbon removal and carbon tech that interest me. So yep, I'm a total nerd about this stuff. Just enjoy every aspect of it. So yeah, happy to chat about any of that in Q&A too. And on the right here is me at the Climeworks Mammoth plant last year. Very fortunate to be able to go and check that out. And when you see it in person, you really see like, okay, this is real. This works. It's really just a matter of scaling this up and getting the cost down and figuring out the market for this. But like the tech is real. This stuff works. And when you see this stuff in person, it's really quite powerful. So I just want to start. Maybe a lot of you have seen this kind of chart before, and if you haven't, that's totally okay too. Essentially, this is just a projection for global emissions. So you see on the vertical axis, we have gigatons or billions of tons of CO2 emissions per year. Right now, we're sitting at maybe around this 40 billion ton, depending on if you're counting methane, nitrous oxide, you might see that number a little bit higher in terms of CO2 equivalents, but often because CO2 is the most important and most influential greenhouse gas, we're often focused on that. So maybe right now we're sitting around this 40 billion tons per year globally mark. Current climate policies maybe don't necessarily have us on track, and it depends what projection you're looking at, but in general, most people acknowledge that we're going to need a lot of progress to bend this curve down. And as you see here, there's this difference between trying to reduce these emissions to zero or closer to zero, and then the negative emissions on the bottom. And so yeah, if you're here today, you've presumably heard about carbon dioxide removal, and it's just really important whenever we talk about carbon removal to really start the conversation by acknowledging that reducing emissions is going to do the bulk of the work in terms of mitigating and addressing climate change. But carbon dioxide removal will also play an instrumental role in helping us reach net zero more quickly, in a more economically optimal and feasible manner, and even a more politically feasible manner. And importantly, at scale, carbon removal will help us go net negative, which will actually help us reverse climate change. And in the long run, and we're talking 100, 200, 300 years, actually reduce the amount of warming that the planet has experienced and will continue to experience for some time. So carbon dioxide removal plays an important and complementary role. There are often debates you will hear about, well, why should we invest in carbon removal if we can do emissions reductions for cheaper? And those are important arguments. They're very important to engage with. But what's important to acknowledge in any of those arguments is that we're going to need, one way or another, based on the best scientific modeling we have now, at least billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal this century, like per year. Cumulatively, it's a lot more. So given that, we need to start scaling up now. We won't be able to just try to do our best reducing emissions, then it's 2050, then all of a sudden we can just turn the tap on and do billions of tons of carbon removal that year. As with any technology, any industry, we're going to have to scale this up. I'm going to say incrementally, but hopefully like exponentially. It's going to have to be a fairly rapid scale up. Modeling has indicated that the scale up that we need is feasible, but only if we get our ducks in a row and are actually able to invest in this, to scale it up, and to do and engage in the proper policies that we need to get the industry to where it needs to go. So with that, there are several primary durable or novel forms of carbon dioxide removal. And so in a minute, I'll talk about how these are distinct from the types of carbon removal that are really most common, most popular in the market today, much cheaper, which would be forestry solutions and soil carbon. So the pathways that I'm laying out here are known as more durable. So they offer a more permanent form of storage that is more appropriate for actually compensating for fossil emissions, which is often the high level use case that we're thinking about for using carbon dioxide removal credits. So on the top here, so we have direct air capture. You're just using chemicals to separate CO2 from the air and then usually storing it underground. You can also sometimes make it into long-lived products like a concrete. It can also be made into fuels and chemicals, but those aren't necessarily carbon removal. You have biomass carbon removal and storage where you grow biomass. As that biomass grows, it takes carbon out of the air via photosynthesis. And then you do something with that biomass to lock up the carbon that biomass took out when it was growing. And next we have enhanced mineralization. So that's where you are using minerals. So that might be from like purpose mined rocks that are reactive with CO2, or it could be waste materials from an industry that are also reactive with CO2. And you use those to either maybe directly take CO2 out of the air, maybe somewhat similar to direct air capture, or maybe you capture CO2 via DAC, or you combust biomass that has biogenic CO2, and then you react it with those minerals to form usually carbonates that store the CO2 for a long time. And then there is a category marine CDR. Sometimes you might refer to it as aquatic CDR because there are freshwater solutions as well that might use rivers or pit lakes. And this category is leveraging carbon cycling that goes on in the ocean and trying to influence those processes in a way that can have them take up more CO2 and hopefully store it in long-lived form, often bicarbonates in the ocean. So these are high-level categories. There are sometimes crossovers between these, and it's not always clear-cut, but what they all have in common is that they are able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And like if the rest of society was at net zero, absolute zero, and then you were to do more of these, we could move into a net negative paradigm. These are all these pathways are also able to create emissions reduction or carbon dioxide removal credits on a ton denominated basis. So you can buy like a ton of DAC credits that is meant to compensate for a ton of your emissions. These categories also roughly align with a categorization that you may have seen in places like XPRIZE of air, land, rocks, and water. And it's actually not really surprising that these are the main categories of carbon removal because they're related to the biogeochemical cycling in nature, like the ways that nature and Earth systems naturally take up CO2, carbon dioxide removal, regardless of if it's a so-called engineered pathway like direct air capture, it's really just trying to anthropogenically accelerate those processes. So I just want to give a quick shout out to what I was mentioning before about soil carbon forestry. A lot of people say, well, why should I pay $200, $300 per ton for an enhanced rock weathering, enhanced mineralization CDR credit when I could pay $20 per ton for a forestry credit? And that's an important question to ask, again, an important debate to engage in, similar to emissions reduction versus carbon removal. I would say that most people, maybe all people in carbon dioxide removal support healthy forests and support soil carbon and healthy soil, healthy crops. We're not against these things, but there is a concern that the carbon that is stored via those pathways is much less durable, much less permanent, much higher risk of being released later on, potentially in 20, 30, 40 years relative to these durable pathways. And emerging climate modeling and just intuitive analysis of the situation suggests that is not those pathways, soil carbon forestry, are not necessarily appropriate for a direct compensation for fossil emissions, where you're digging up carbon from like oil or gas that's been underground for millions of years and putting it into the atmosphere. Ideally, if you truly want to reverse that, you need to then take that carbon out and put it into more durable storage. So that's not to say that these aren't valuable things to fund and to sponsor, but it is important to understand that in the long run, assuming that the policy and market dynamics are eventually aligned with the science, it will not be appropriate to use those credits to abate or to compensate for fossil or lithospheric emissions. This is sometimes called the like for like principle. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A, but it's definitely important. And it points to the need to start funding these more durable pathways today, even if they're a little bit more expensive. So this is a huge slide. I know we're not going to drill into every bullet point here. I do want to point out that this slide came from this primer on carbon dioxide removal credits that was developed by the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at DOE. I didn't help make that slide deck, but I helped review it and improve it a little bit. It is, I don't think it's available on the DOE website anymore, but there is a copy of it that is available in the last slide of this deck that will be sent around or may have already been sent around, that you'll be able to click on and read through. So that's an amazing slide deck. I highly recommend looking through it. But I borrowed a few key slides that I wanted to chat about with you all today. What this slide shows is key players in the purchasing journey, really kind of in the whole carbon dioxide removal market journey. And so you have all the way from facilitating supply on the left. So these are the folks who are actually trying to do and to sponsor, underwrite, enable that process of carbon dioxide removal, those durable CDR pathways we were talking about on the last slide. Trust and integrity. So I like to say that trust is the foundation of the carbon dioxide removal market. It's a strange market relative to a lot of commodities because in a lot of commodity markets, you get something tangible. You can get that. You can get the ton of stainless steel. You can get the kill a liter of ethylene or something, and you can analyze it. You can check its quality. In carbon dioxide removal, you're paying someone who could be across the world from you to take carbon out of the air and put it underground. You don't necessarily get anything with most CDR pathways. There are some that have co-products or like tangible products where the carbon is stored. Maybe there's aggregates, construction fill, these other things. But often you need to trust that someone else is removing that carbon. So there are a series of entities, many of which are separate from the actual project developers, the actual people removing the carbon to reduce conflicts of interest, who audit these processes, who develop standards, who check, who rate projects to ensure that there is quality. Facilitating demand. So a lot of these are maybe somewhat similar to what one might see or have experienced in the emissions reduction credit or forestry credit market. You have folks like marketplaces, advisory services, buyers groups, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later in the presentation. And then finally, over here, we have buying CDR. So hopefully that's a lot of you on this call who might be, actually purchasing this. There's discussions about government procurement of carbon dioxide removal credits at some point. Of course, as Tina mentioned in the beginning, some governments, of course in the United States, but also perhaps around the world, are facing fiscal issues and maybe kind of altering their climate policies. And so the voluntary carbon market, just companies just buying these credits for a variety of reasons we'll talk about, is key to establishing and scaling this industry. So there's a ton of specific examples of firms in all of these categories. So on the bottom here, I linked to a few market maps that you can check out. And I highly recommend checking those out and seeing the different firms and just getting up to speed with the different folks in these different categories. But I will admit it is a lot to wrap your head around in the beginning. In terms of the CDR purchasing process, so we have a few, this is another slide from the FECM primer, which I again recommend checking out, and it goes into more detail about all of these things. But there's a general high-level process here where you're kind of preparing, you're getting approval, setting the budget, doing your strategy. Then there's the actual purchasing or like due diligence and purchasing process. There's a few different options for how you can go about this. And finally, there's a kind of like retirement and accounting step for those things. So in the middle, purchasing, there are examples where you can purchase directly from a supplier. So one example could be, for example, Climeworks engages in direct relationships, or 1.5, two direct air capture companies that engage in direct relationships with people who want, usually firms, who want to buy credits. They sign an offtake agreement, and then the credits are delivered on some pre-established timeline. It's relatively straightforward, but it puts the onus of due diligence on you, on the buyer. And so that's not everybody's cup of tea. Maybe they don't feel comfortable. They don't want to take the risk. They don't have the in-house capabilities to do that. So you may be able to, or you may choose to purchase in a buyer's group. So Frontier is maybe one of the best known buyers groups in this area. They bring companies together, they kind of pool funds, and they have maybe just one team doing the due diligence. And then that team will make recommendations to the different buyers in the buyers club. And ultimately the buyers have power. They're not, I mean, depending on the structure, they're not necessarily going to be forced to do something maybe that they're not comfortable with, they don't approve. But the idea is that they put some trust in that buyers group to find deals, to do the due diligence, and to do a good job. It's also nice because then you're not buying alone. You would be buying with other folks, other firms. And so maybe there's some risk that's mitigated there in terms of reputation. You can also follow, hey, I trust this company, I trust, say, Microsoft to do a really good job. And if I'm in a similar buyers group or something, maybe you have some increased comfort that comes with that. Finally, there's marketplaces as well. So this isn't necessarily always for bigger deals. And if there's big offtakes, a lot of money on the table, you may prefer to purchase directly, have more control over the specific offtake contract, which I'll mention which I'll talk a little bit more about in a future slide, but that is an option as well. Some of those are available on the market maps discussed in the previous slide. In terms of strategy, so I just wanted to call out a few things, and some of these reasons might be actually why if you are here today, if you're a potential or current buyer. So when people are thinking about, well, what do I care about when I'm looking at buying CDR? You might be thinking about how can I have the biggest climate impact possible? You might be thinking about, well, I use this kind of GHG accounting. I'm trying to be compliant with SBTI, something like that. Are these credits going to work? Are they going to work for me? You have to think through that. There's definitely a marketing, kind of a public relations angle here. So there might be certain qualities of the companies or projects you invest in. Are they in my same geography? Do they kind of fit with my broader story? What kinds of co-benefits or community benefits do these projects create? And that might be valuable for you as you report on and talk about the credits in the companies that you're supporting. Budget, obviously, am I going to be able to get future credits here? We'll talk a little bit more about that on the contract slide. And then fit into your general portfolio. A lot of companies with a climate strategy, they're trying to do a lot of things. They're trying to reduce emissions. They're trying to be more energy efficient. They're trying to sign renewable energy PPAs. They're trying to use compostable, products. They're trying to cut down on animal products. They're trying to do a lot of things. And then maybe they also want to do carbon removal. Maybe you want to do different kinds of carbon removal. So you want to think about that portfolio and what works best for you. And where you land for these different considerations is going to ultimately influence what you think about buying. So on this slide and the following slide, I just have several topics, and we can talk about any of these more in the Q&A, but these are common topics that when a firm, a buyer's group, a consultant, an investor is doing due diligence on a specific carbon dioxide removal company, often a startup, or a project, what are they thinking about? What are they asking? The answers to these questions, there's not necessarily an objective right answer necessarily. The answer sometimes will need to correspond with the strategic considerations we were considering on the last slide. So for example, previous sales. You might be concerned with, hey, carbon dioxide removal company, how many sales have you had to date? And if you have maybe a little bit more of a conservative and risk intolerant approach to buying CDR, you might want to go to a company that's already sold a lot of carbon removal because you know that, hey, you've already sold, that's one piece of evidence that might have a more legitimate operation. But everybody needs to start somewhere. It's a chicken and egg problem if everybody was like that. So some companies, if they want to take a little bit more risk and maybe get more of a catalytic market or climate impact from that, or potentially a marketing impact, like we support innovation, we support early stage tech, you might want to be the first buyer. So that's an example of one of these questions where there's not like an objective right answer per se. It depends on what your personal strategy is. So you can see different questions, sales and investment, things looking at, well, who else invested? Who else bought? Are those legitimate entities? Do I want to follow them? Or maybe do I want to be the first? You have things like pathway. What CDR pathway is it under? So we talked about the main pathways on that, one of those first slides we chatted about today. There's DAC, enhanced minimization, so forth. But it is important to understand, is this a common pathway or is this relatively fringe? There are certain things like solid sorbent direct air capture paired with geologic storage that if they're complying with the appropriate MRV protocols, it's pretty good to go. Like it's going to be expensive, but you can have pretty good confidence that, okay, that this is a legitimate, well-known type of CDR, and people in the climate space, if I told them I bought a DAC credit, they're going to know what that means. If the company is doing some kind of like, we're going to grow this crop and then we're going to burn half of it to generate energy. Then we're going to take some of the residues and then we're going to make that into a concrete block that we're going to use. Then we're going to put it in the ocean. Then we're going to sink it and the carbon's going to be locked down there. And that maybe sounds wild, but there are companies that have these very convoluted strategies. Well, now you got to start being a little bit more wary, saying like, whoa, I don't know about this. I got to do some more due diligence, more investigation here. So definitely want to be careful there. Impact team, some of these are relatively straightforward, but I will point out project progress. If you're a buyer and you're talking to a company, They want to sell you all these credits and they say the plant's going to be operational in 2026. Really? Like a lot of people, especially startups, make bold claims and you got to be ready. And that's some of this you can iron out contractually, which we'll talk about. But a lot of people out there are making big claims, and ultimately building real facilities is way harder than anyone thinks. So you want to understand, is this project under construction? Do you have a final investment decision? Is your final investment decision contingent on me signing an offtake? You want to understand that order of operations, that series of events between this second and you getting and retiring that credit, and understand how confident you are in that all those steps will be able to be accomplished. So this next slide, price is important. Understand obviously how much you're paying, because that aligns, that's going to matter for your budget. It's also important to understand, is the startup losing money? Are they selling you a credit under their cost just to try to win the deal? And are you okay with that? Or would you prefer to actually pay a little bit more to make a more financially sustainable operation for them? You also want to understand what their projected prices are, which is going to be a function of many variables, but at its core, their cost curve, both for a specific facility, but also as they innovate with that technology and scale up over time. How's that price going to change? And if you as a buyer are going to have a continued relationship with that company, well, are you going to get access to those cheaper credits in the future? So ironing out those things is another important thing contractually. It's important to consider. MRV, sometimes called MMRV, measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification, is fundamental to the carbon dioxide removal space. Going back to what we were talking about before about trust being so important and foundational for the CDR market. How MRV has come to work is that there are protocols, also called methodologies, that are often published by registries such as Puro and Isometric and Vera. And they'll publish these protocols. There might be public comments. There's a lot of people who work on it. And then it's finally like published and okay, people can use this protocol. There are some companies that try to work with project developers to get them compliant with those protocols and try to facilitate that process, because it can be very confusing for project developers. There's a lot of boxes to check. But you want to understand as a buyer, like, how are these credits being minted? Like, where are they? Where do they exist in the ether? And often, yeah, they're going to have to comply with one of these protocols. And there's specific protocols, not just for the high level, like DAC, mineralization, bikers, and MCDR pathways we talked about, but even for those sub pathways. There's biochar protocols. There's direct air capture with storage and in carbonated products protocols. There are BECS, bioenergy and CCS protocols, and so on and so forth. And each one can dig into the science and really get quite particular. So you want to know as a buyer, like, what protocols are you using? And if it's a relatively new company, are they compliant yet? Sometimes they're going to need to get that project going first to even have the data to then qualify for that protocol. So you want to, again, understand that order of operations. Again, what is between now and me getting and retiring that credit? Co-benefits, we mentioned in the strategy slide. A lot of carbon dioxide removal pathways can do more than just help the climate and generate these credits for sale. They may create jobs. That project might be funding local projects that are important, or maybe it's a biochar pathway and it serves as soil amendment, or maybe it's enhanced rock weathering and it's helping agricultural yields. Maybe there's some kind of co-product that it produces. Hey, we do DAC, but we also produce this low carbon hydrogen that maybe subsidizes the credit a little bit. So you want to understand what are those co-benefits, and then what are the financial, marketing, or just societal benefits that come from that. And maybe as a buyer, you want to support things that are better for society. Hopefully so. Scalability is important, validation, timeline. When are these credits going to be available? What vintage are they going to be? So vintage, if you haven't seen that term before, it's essentially what year was that credit created? There could be some funky stuff if the credit was created in 2023, but you're trying to retire it in 2026. Usually it's not going to be like ex ante. You're not necessarily going to be able to do a retirement based on a promised future credit, but there are pre-purchases where you might make an announcement, but you're not necessarily retiring that credit until it's actually generated. But working out that timeline, understanding that's important. So risks are also obviously important to any kind of deal like this. So you have this slide here, again, borrowed from the primer deck, on different kinds of risks that these projects might face. Some of them are relatively straightforward. Hey, the company just can't deliver. There's some kind of problem with their MRV. Reversal risks are a problem in carbon dioxide removal. What if that CO2 that was captured and stored finds its way back into the atmosphere? Who's liable? Is there a buffer pool? Is there insurance? What happens? What about the timeline? What if it happens 150 years from now? But I thought the credit was going to have 1,000-year durability. So there's all these really interesting things that need to be ironed out. Some of that happens in the offtake agreement. Some of that can happen with insurance, and there's insurance providers that I think were on that key players slide. So there's a few key insurance folks out there try to work through these problems. Also, obviously, reputational risks. This is just a sample. Some of the insurance firms have really good resources on all the different risks out there. So you definitely want to think through these and figure out how to mitigate them, which may involve choosing different projects, having different requirements, or changing the contract, as we'll talk about on the following slide. So focusing on high quality projects, what does high quality mean? Again, that's tricky. That's going to involve some of this due diligence and leaning on experts. Portfolio strategy, if you diversify, have a lot of different projects, a lot of different companies, maybe you can diversify away some of that risk, but there still probably are some correlated risks across the whole space that it's worthwhile to keep in mind. Contract terms, insurance mentioned, collaborating with experts is obviously key. And that's also ties back to the buyer's group point. So this is common contract terms. Again, there's a lot here. We won't go into everything. And we'll, again, send this deck out so you can check this out. And this also comes from the DOE deck, so you can check it out there. I also recommend checking out, I have it linked in the upper right here, Frontiers offtake deck, offtake template. They published a somewhat generic version of the offtake agreement that they maybe use possibly as a foundation for their deal making. Definitely worthwhile looking at. I would assume a lot of attorneys and other folks spend a lot of time really thinking through everything there and diving in. But there's a lot of things to be specified. And as you embark on your journey of looking at carbon dioxide removal credits, if you're fortunate enough to get to this point of trying to iron out these deals, these are a lot of the kinds of things that you're going to see in those contracts. How's the payment working? What's the delivery? Am I paying you now, or am I going to pay on delivery of those credits? Do I have a right of first refusal? This is a common term that comes up in some of these contracts, which means that sometimes a buyer might engage with a carbon removal supplier, but then as part of that deal, sometimes a very large deal, they would say, well, any future credits you offer from this project or otherwise, you might have to offer to me first before you offer to others. And that's a sweetener for the buyer. And it's part of the reason that buyers might want to get in now. If they think that they're going to have to buy carbon removal credits one way or another in the future, you probably want to have those options now. That option to buy from quality projects, maybe at more reasonable prices. So that can be a really good incentive for getting into this now. And there's a bunch of other things you read about here, remedies that gets into the insurance, reverse risk, all these kinds of things. So definitely good to think through. There's a little note on the bottom right about equity investments. There are some buyers that like to make it actually invest if they're in the position to do so in one of the suppliers, but then maybe also buy credits. All kinds of deals. You definitely can get quite creative here. So on my final slide here before the resources slide, just want to note about treading carefully. It's a buyer's market. So CDR companies, I mean, they're hungry to sell you these credits. So you definitely want to exercise some caution here. Really want to maintain skepticism, lean on expertise of either your in-house teams and experts, your own intuition, various consultants that are out there who can advise on this. Buyers clubs may even be worthwhile if you're making substantial investments, getting multiple perspectives and comparing those perspectives independently. Investigating the academic provenance of the technology. So did this just pop out of some inventor's mind and there's not really like a patent or academic articles? Or has this process existed and been examined in peer-reviewed literature? You definitely want to understand a bit of that. Look to social proof. So this goes back to the due diligence topics, looking at prior sales and investments. Maybe you feel more comfortable if lower carbon invested because they're a big fancy climate tech VC that has a lot of due diligence capacity. So maybe you trust them if they invested. Maybe if Frontier buys, well, if Frontier does it, or if Microsoft does it, maybe it's good enough for me. But maybe you want to forge your own way. Definitely reputations of the team. It's mentioned on the due diligence slide. And if you're looking at different companies, compare their responses to some of the questions you ask them and then check out, okay, which ones do I feel most comfortable with? So yeah, that does it for the main content. I have some additional resources here, and there are tons of resources, tons of media about carbon dioxide removal out there. So what I selected here are the things that I would recommend for buyers that are getting into this. If they want to see some different topics, the credit primer is linked at the top here. So definitely recommend checking out that full deck because there's so much detail there. It's wild. But definitely also recommend checking out some of these other resources that provide some advice and other recommendations for getting into this for businesses that are starting to get into CDR, understanding what is CDR, how much needs to happen, how can I kind of align this with my own emissions targets. There's also some amazing resources from CDR.FYI, which is viewed in the space as one of the top data resources for analyzing the CDR market. It's definitely worthwhile checking that out as well. And then there's a couple company lists down here too. The DAC company list I made and maintain, and then there's some other CDR company lists if you want to see a big sample. So that does it. So thank you very much. And we can move into Q&A now.
All right, thank you, Grant. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate everybody that's here. I saw a bunch of questions in the chat. If you have questions at the moment, throw them in the chat, and we've got some time to get to them. So first off, I saw Adriana had a question, and I wanted to call her up to ask it.
Yeah, sure.
Hey, Adriana.
How are you?
Good to see you.
So, Grant, in the first or second slide, you have the trending line above. I'm curious to see, like, if the U.S. government moves the perspective from
your party's extension or would like to access the
to adaptation. Is that current climate policy line going to go farther up, or what is the perspective?
Yeah, so I borrowed that chart from the WBCSD, like the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. I'm actually not totally sure what they base that current climate policy line on. And I've seen many different versions of that chart that have all kinds of different lines going all over the place. Some of the modeling, I would recommend in terms of the US, checking out some of the modeling from Jesse Jenkins' lab at Princeton. And they have some really good modeling and analysis showing like what the projected US emissions trajectories would be depending on levels of implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and of other associated tax credits, as well as some of the modeling from the Rhodium Group on US emissions that you may be interested in. So I think a lot of that really comes down to not just the new administration, but also what Congress does to the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Act, other related things. Of course, there's a lot of big headlines. Oh, US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. If a Democrat wins next time around, we might be right back in. And obviously the swing's not necessarily good, but in terms of the hardcore stuff that's really going to impact emissions reductions in the near term, like to 2030, 2035, I think a lot of people think that a lot of those emissions reductions are going to be driven by, or a lot of the counterfactual emissions reductions would be driven by tax credits. So it matters a lot what Congress does with those credits, and then also how the administration moves to implement them or not. But yeah, I don't know if that, I wouldn't lean too much on the first line that I showed there.
All right, thank you all. I'm looking through the chat, so if anybody has questions, Alexander, I see your question too. I see your hand up. I'm gonna ask Jen Hebert. Do you want to come up and ask your question?
Thanks. Hey, Grant. It's good to run into you again. I just was curious how you think about the tension between co-benefits and additionality.
Yeah, definitely. So I think about additionality, which is one of the core carbon principles set out by the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon markets. Additionality can take a few forms. Sometimes it's financial additionality, where you're asking, does this project absolutely require carbon finance, which is your purchase of the carbon dioxide removal credits to move forward? There can also be policy additionality, which is, does policy require this project to go forward anyway? And if it does, then your funds are not the most additionally spent there. So it's really asking, like, is your engagement with it necessary for that project to happen when it otherwise wouldn't have? And if it does, then it's additional, or you could think about it as incremental or marginal. So it's making an emissions removal impact above and beyond what would have happened anyway. So goes the analysis. There is debate about how additionality should be defined. I would say co-benefits is much broader and can encompass things from the direct job creation and other economic impacts from a carbon removal project or a company. It could encompass hey, a carbon dioxide removal project developer comes into a community and they're building a big DAC plant, but they provide a ton of funding for, say, local food bank or a local sports team. That is maybe not a co-benefit that's directly related to the operation of that facility, but it's something that still provides a benefit for the local community. There can also, some people conceptualize co-benefits as something that is a direct result of the process. So the example I used of, hey, we put this biochar in this agricultural field and it helps preserve soil health and fertility. So it's a benefit that would be above and beyond that carbon dioxide removal. So I suppose you could think about the additionality of co-benefits in a sense, but usually we're talking about additionality for the carbon dioxide removal attribute of that process. And then the co-benefits are other non-carbon dioxide removal attributes that benefit society.
Thank you. I think it was that very last category where it feels like the two concepts are in opposition of each other, particularly where you have, let's say, a soil benefit and carbon dioxide removal or carbon dioxide is durably stored. That's where it starts to blur the, well, would we have done this anyway? Would this project have existed without? And I really appreciate the opening of the aperture as we think of both additionality as well as co-benefits to include things like community benefits. Thank you.
Definitely, yeah. I see Ross is on the call here, and we did a podcast on reversing climate change maybe about a month and a half ago, where we were discussing this and about financial additionality and shouldn't we, reduce the requirements on additionality because carbon removal processes that maybe would have still happened otherwise, we should still support and scale up, and maybe additionality exists on a systems level rather than a project level. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff to dig in there, and I have come around to believe that yes, and especially in our current political and market context, processes with co-benefits are good, and we should support them as much as possible because they will be more sustainable, more resilient, more scalable. But with that said, I'm not convinced that there's enough of such processes to reach the 5-10 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal we need per year. So similar to how we support carbon dioxide removal in addition to emissions reduction, because we know we're going to need both, I think we need to support both CDR processes with and without these co-benefits, with and without financial additionality, whatever, so we can scale up this portfolio to truly reach our total goal.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Grant. Next up, we had Alexander. You had your hand up.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Tito, for organizing this and Grant for being on. Really great presentation. I had a quick question from a supplier's perspective. Like, a conversation that we're seeing is that people are saying, look, eventually we're going to get to a regulatory market, right? Eventually this is all going to be compliance-based, either similar to ETS or similar to what we're seeing in China now. And they're saying, well, why would I invest at potentially 200 or 1,700 a ton in a voluntary market using methodologies and standards that we don't necessarily know with 100% certainty are going to fall under some of these regulatory markets down the road? These might be credits that we can't really claim when the compliance scheme hits. So that's kind of part A to the question. And part B is, if that's the case today, what's the benefit for a company buying voluntary credits other than for reporting purposes, instead of buying something like a tax deduction based CDR thing like what's offered by TerraSet currently?
These are tough questions. And they sit at the crux of part of this issue of the voluntary carbon market and scaling up CDR and supporting it. I would say that if people are thinking like that, they're maybe going to be more in this early to late adopter category of the like the adoption life cycle. And a lot of the folks we're going to want to support CDR now are going to be more in that visionary innovator kind of early adopter category. I would say if you're even thinking about carbon dioxide removal at all, as opposed to emissions reduction, you're already part of the way there. You're already part of the way to seeing and understanding that yes, things are going to be cheaper, different in the future, but I still need to do my part to support this like fledgling and growing industry today. In terms of the ETS thing and qualification, it's again tricky because those things are not set in stone yet. And that's what's really challenging is there's like self-reinforcing feedback loops and other dependencies that are really interesting here, where if enough buyers come together and support, say, biochar, maybe then those buyers and the biochar coalition, they all kind of come together under a big tent, and then they lean on or it influences what the regulators view as feasible. And then maybe they adopt biochar in the compliance market when maybe it wouldn't have been otherwise. And so maybe their support of it helps their support today of things that they might be uncertain about its compliance qualifications in the future could help make that the case. But also then, do we want a system that works like that? Or do we want policymakers and regulators just sitting on a cloud, completely unattached from anything else, just purely using like science and reason to make policy? Some people would say yes, some people would say no, you need to be more pragmatic and realistic to have durable policy. So it's challenging. I'm not sure that there are answers to these questions that are that great. And I think it's just messy. It's just we're like just caught in this really messy time. I would also say there are probably folks who have a much more coherent response to this question as well. And I would definitely recommend you chat with some of the folks at different trade groups like the DAC Coalition, Carbon Business Council, Carbon Removal Alliance, because they might have a better sense of the kinds of arguments and justifications that you could use as a supplier in that context.
Thanks for that.
All right, next up we've got Angela.
Thanks, Tito. Thanks, Grant, for putting this together. And I'm actually going to have a follow-on to Alex's question, but click into the buyer's perspective, especially a mid-sized buyer that doesn't have the deep wallet to participate in Frontier. They're not a hyperscaler. They don't have 80% margin. And what I'm hearing is a lot of these mid-sized sustainability managers, CFO, they still want to do something, right? But now there's green hushing happening. Very curious to hear your perspective on what are some of the hurdles that's barring them from participating. So for example, we're also seeing there's marketplaces like Patch, et cetera, right? They really do the hand holding for people that, don't have the deep pockets to participate in Frontier. And I think a big part is they offer some kind of portfolio management in case projects go under, they can do a like for like replacement. So what are some of the, just curious to get your thoughts on like, for a mid-market player, if they really want to participate, what are some of the hurdles that you see and what are some of the market resources that are really addressing some of these hurdles right now? Or maybe there's a gap and that gap needs to be filled.
Yeah, definitely. I think in terms of hurdles, budget is one and justification. Why should we pay $200, $300, $400, $500, up to $1,000 per ton for these credits when we could get cheaper forestry, soil, emissions reduction credits is a tough one. I think general knowledge of carbon dioxide removal is tough. Data for Progress recently did an updated survey of US voters and like awareness of carbon dioxide removal. And despite the fact that for a lot of folks in the industry, perhaps on this call, it's our life, and we think about it like all day, every day as we're working, most Americans don't. Most Americans like never even heard of it. And that trend is probably true around the world too. It's probably generalizable to some extent. So I think that education piece, getting people to understand what is carbon removal? Why is it needed? What are the types? How can we get from A to B to C and so forth is definitely another hurdle. And I think that if you check out those market maps that I linked to from Puro and EIP, these are big markets. And I've been working in carbon tech since 2018, and I still have a little bit of trouble understanding like how is ICVC different from BCMI, which is different from ICROA, which is different from marketplaces, which is different from registries. Like it's kind of wild. There's a lot of stuff, and there's companies coming up, and there's other things going bankrupt and going out, and there's consolidation, and it's wild. So I think just wrapping your head around that, and then like you mentioned, I think you said about green hushing. There's this fear of doing something, trying to do the right thing, and getting punished on the other end, especially with all the horrible stuff going on with forestry. So it's just tricky. So I think in terms of addressing it, it's always prudent to spend a good fair bit of time developing a strategy, engaging with multiple experts independently or perhaps together, getting their opinions, their perspectives, and seeing where there's alignment. And then I would give another plug for the Buyers Club. And I know Frontier's maybe a little tricky for companies that don't have as many funds. There's other Buyers Clubs that are being investigated for like smaller, medium size enterprises. And I think engaging with them is going to be powerful for bringing firms together, giving them access collectively to expertise. So yeah, I definitely so I guess my high level, just taking time and really developing a robust strategy with experts, and then engaging with buyers clubs and other folks with expertise in this market and also looking to regulatory trends and signs as well, like EU CRCF. I'd say all those are a good start.
And a quick follow on is what is your personal and understanding the market is constantly changing, new resources are coming on all day long. There all these new registries coming online. There's like the project rating system. There's quite a few startups. They have carbon project rating, right? So, from a buyer's perspective, oh my God, do they go to see what kind of registry the project is registered on? Or is it the rating? Or is it, social proof who else is buying? Like, how would you advise them, like in terms of like priority level, that kind of source of truth? Like maybe, yeah, they should go read the standard first. They should go work with the expert first. But in terms of all the other market resources, how should they kind of prioritize their time and attention on spending their time understanding the different resources available?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, I would say in terms of registries protocols, I would say the biggest player, my first stops for those would be Puro, Isometric, and Vera to some extent. There's of course other great work being done with the European biochar certificate as well, that if you're into biochar, I would look into that as well. But those would probably be my first stop, and probably taking some time to review the higher level standards that inform both Puro and Isometric's methodology development. So how it works is there are methodologies, or also called protocols, that are developed for the specific pathways, whether it's biochar or DAC and carbonated products, other things. And those are often informed by and have to be compliant with a higher level standard that's put out by Puro, Isometric. And then those standards often have to comply with things like the core carbon principles, but then they might add other things in there. So I would say that's a really good first stop for understanding what does it mean to have a quality carbon dioxide removal project. So I think that's a really good place to start, and then really drilling down on like what is a registry and what are the protocols, because the MRV standards are ultimately just fundamental for minting carbon dioxide removal credits and for being able to like account for them, retire them, have some degree of trust. I would also recommend checking out things like the EU CRCF and understanding how folks are trying to do that on a governmental level. Canada also recently released a direct air capture protocol that might be worthwhile looking at. So I think that's a really good place to start. And I would also recommend the other resources linked in the deck. That Deborah linked to, but yeah, we'll be sent around too.
Amazing, thank you.
All right, thanks, Grant. We've got a ton of questions queued up. I am prioritizing the ones from buyers and investors, and I think we've got time for one, maybe two questions. We've got Scott, who's coming at it from an investment perspective.
Thanks, Tito. Good to see everyone here. I'm interested in providing capital to accelerating projects from hey, we've secured an offtake agreement. Now we need to build and construct these facilities to fill the offtake agreement. Where are these conversations happening? Where for these types of projects are right at that negotiation phase during the buyer trying to secure an offtake and the suppliers for the potential projects. I think this missing middle gap is really a major issue in fulfilling the building of facilities. That's really what I'm trying to address, and trying to figure out where to navigate or how to be assisted in that specific location.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and I definitely concur with you on that point, that it's super important to engage in that. I would say buyers clubs like Frontier would be pretty top of mind, because they're just in this process frequently of getting these proposals, evaluating. There's other buyers clubs out there that you can check out, maybe some new buyers clubs coming up. But sadly, I think a lot of these conversations are privately happening between project developers, the project/tech developers, because often they straddle both categories at this point in time, as well as potential buyers. And so how do you get access to that? I mean, it's challenging. I think it's you just have to grind a little bit and develop relationships and networks with actual project developers, because there's a fair bit of confidential information, under the hood stuff. There's a substantial amount of offtakes that have been signed that have not been reported publicly for one reason or another. And so it's just challenging. Even people who are really in the loop might not necessarily be privy to that. So it's really just about having those personal relationships, building those networks with project developers. And yeah, if you're like an investor or buyer and reach out to most CDR companies, I think they're going to be pretty excited to want to chat with you.
Thanks, Grant.
All right, one last one. We have Habib from Boston Consulting Group with a write-in who's traveling right now. And the question was, any tips for simplifying purchase contracts for buyers and suppliers?
Simplifying, I'm not sure that I have the best perspective there. I think standardizing is a good way to go. So I'm happy with what Frontier's trying to do. And at DOE, we were working on a project. I don't know if that's going to move forward or not, but we were also trying to do like an offtake standardization thing. Simplifying stuff because carbon removal is complex. These deals are complex. And there's a lot of provisions, a lot of things to consider. So I think the best you're going to do is really standardizing with fair and meaningful terms. But I don't know, other people, attorneys who actually work on these offtakes, folks at buyers clubs who are more negotiating these offtakes might have a better perspective on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. That's all the time we have for questions, folks. I want to let you know about two other opportunities we have. We've got the next round of our Buyers Academy, which is it's online course for people who are up and coming sustainability leaders who want to take the lead on carbon removal credits. It's free. You can check out the link in the chat and to sign up to get more information about that. Also put the link in for the Air Miners Buyers Club that we're building to offer that more accessible safety in numbers, access to good pricing, access to the diligence process to meet with teams that are making carbon as we go through the process, and access to group media if you want that. So you've got both of the links there. Grant, I really thank you for sharing this today with this whole community, with the next generation of sustainability leaders who are leading the way on reversing climate change. And I also thank everybody else for being here, for the great questions, and for inviting all of your friends and your colleagues and your customers and supply chain partners and everybody here.